Today I have a short and sweet little video for you in which I'm showing you how I work from reference photos in a way where I am not just copying what it is that I'm seeing, but I'm actually in charge of making decisions about what it is I want to bring out and what it is I want to push into the background. And like that, I put my own signature onto the piece. If that sounds interesting, stay tuned. If we haven't met yet, my name is Carolin and I help artists get over technical knowledge gaps and help them get their big ideas onto the page so they can finally create the art they've always wanted to. If that sounds like you, hit like, subscribe, become part of the community, and let's get into this demonstration today. So here you can see the image I've chosen for myself, the steer standing in this field. And the first thing you really need to do when you work from a reference is to chart it out. So what does that mean? To chart it out is what you're seeing me do on the left there. You decide, do I want to have the frame that the photo has given me, like this vertical rectangle, or do I want to alter that a little bit, make it shorter, wider, more square maybe? And then what are the sections within the image? So here I have the section in the background of the trees grouping together. I have that light little sliver kind of right where the head is. Then I have the full middle ground, which is the ground behind the deer. I have the foreground, which is the ground in front of the deer, and I have the deer itself. So those are my zones, and I like to think of them in flat terms. What if this was a puzzle and I could cut those puzzle pieces out into their simplest shapes? So that is what you're seeing me working on right here, just charting these very complex things in nature into very simplistic terms. Now, the reason why I do this is because like that, I can be very clear in how I want to treat them, how I want to design with them, because as I said in the intro, when we draw and we're really drawing, we don't just want to copy, we want to make choices about the things that we're looking at. And there is a useful way of making these choices, and then there is a not so useful way of making these choices. When we simplify things like this and we draw on what's called a thumbnail sketch, we can test things out of how they will feel if we do this or that with it. So here I can test out how it feels when I make the deer much darker than the background. So if you look at the reference, the deer and the background, they're very similar in their tonality. So rather than me just copying it the way I see it, which isn't very creative, there's no artistic decision making involved in there, I am testing out what is it like, what does it feel like if I push the contrast between the deer and the background? How will that affect me? And in turn, how will that affect the viewer? And as you can imagine, a not so useful way of testing this out is on the finished piece. Now, you probably know this, why it's not a good idea, because you're already emotionally involved in the finished piece and you're going to be reluctant to make changes once you're in the middle of it, right? So once you have your thumbnail and you know what it is that you are aiming for, you've made up your mind what changes you will have to make from the actual reference photo to get a more powerful, a more interesting result, then you go ahead and you work on the finished piece. So in this case, because it was just a short little sketch for this demonstration, I'm not scaling up very much in size, but I am making a slightly larger version of it now. Now let me list out a couple of the elements that you can play with and that you can adjust in your own piece to put your signature onto your drawing. As I mentioned in the beginning, the format is your starting point. The format is the frame that you maintain around your subject matter. And just so you understand, the frames that we pick will have a different emotional connotation. So a vertical frame is a little bit more active and it has more of a sense of perseverance, whereas a horizontal frame is a little bit more calming and a little bit more soothing. So in this case, I maintained the verticality of the format because it speaks of dignity, which I thought was fitting for this deer. Next, you can play around with placement. Just because the deer is placed in the middle of the image in the photo doesn't mean you have to maintain that. In general, if you place something dead center, it becomes a bit more static, a little bit more boring. So shifting your main subject matter off to the side a little bit becomes just a little bit more engaging, a little bit more visually dynamic. So that is the placement. And that doesn't just go for your main visual element, it goes for anything that's within your frame. Just because it's in the photo doesn't mean you have to put it into your drawing. And I really want to drive this point home because you don't want to become a slave to your reference. You always want to feel like you're the one deciding what gets into your finished product and what stays out of it. And this leads to the next variable. It's called shape design. So often you may have a reference image where certain areas look visually confusing. So in this case, what was a little bit confusing was how the ear and the antlers were sitting in front of each other. So when that happens, you don't have to copy it the way it looks. You can pretend like you can see it from a slightly different angle where the shapes become more clear. So you're designing the shapes to look more like themselves. This is especially useful when you draw the figure and you have a very strange, lumpy appearance, and then you can just draw it as if it was seen from a minute shift over to the right or a minute shift over to the left, which will yield then a more clear shape design. And just in case you're struggling with lumpy looking shapes, I'm putting a video in the top right corner that will help you get more specific, well-designed shapes. While we're still talking about shapes, we also have to mention scale. So in this case, I maintained the scale of everything because I liked the way it felt. But I want you to understand that, let's say you zoomed in more onto your subject matter, that has an effect on how we perceive it. The more you zoom in on something, the more particular, the more specific it becomes, the more we, the viewer, will think of it as an individual. The more you zoom away from something, the more you zoom out, so therefore decrease and make the scale smaller of something, the more general, the more removed we become from it. And sometimes you need that effect, but in this case, I did want it to feel like we're encountering this very particular deer and we're seeing its dignity as an individual. So therefore, we're pretty far zoomed in, and therefore the scale of it is pretty big in relationship to the format. All right, next variable. We already talked about this earlier in the video. This variable is a big one, especially for this video. Value. Now, just because your reference gives you a certain set of values, again, you do not have to copy them. This is the big theme of this video. You're in charge, you get to decide. And the type of value groups you choose to build up in your drawing will affect, again, the emotional connotation. So if you have all super light values, it will read more ethereal, more dreamlike, more soft. If you have all darks, almost like the actual reference itself, your drawing may have more of a somber note to it, maybe a more threatening or depressive note to it. So here's what I want you to do when you are deciding what type of value scheme to build. Come back to the earliest step in this video where we charted out the different zones into two-dimensional puzzle pieces. And think of every puzzle piece in need of its own little value group. Now, I'm not talking about value variation here, where we're modeling from light to dark. I'm literally thinking in terms of simple value puzzle pieces. And it's really powerful if you can reduce these puzzles into just 3 or 4 values like I did on the left. If the drawing looks and reads interesting and powerful in this thumbnail version, then you have a strong value scheme, one that will carry over into the big version. If the one on the left looks boring, you have some more work to do. So think about how much contrast do you want to build. In this case, I wanted a lot of contrast. I wanted to have the deer contrast more with a background than the reference was providing me. So therefore, I decreased the value of the deer. So I took that little value swatch, that little value shape of the deer, and made it darker. And the value swatch, the puzzle piece of the background and middle ground, I made that much lighter than in the actual reference. And then I am also deciding the tree part of the background is going to be slightly darker than the middle ground part. So now I have this plan in my mind, and that will result in the deer visually popping forward. Anytime we have contrast, we attract the viewer's attention. So again, one more time, contrast attracts attention. So therefore, be very wise with where you put the contrast. In this case, it's all about the deer. Therefore, I put the contrast onto the deer. And this makes us roll right into the next variable, which is detail. Tendencies are to put details everywhere. And this is a tendency I want to discourage you from, because it's like a movie that has too many stars in it. You want to have a very concentrated zone of details in the places you want the people to look at. If you have details everywhere, it makes people not understand where they're supposed to look, and they get confused, and then they want to visually exit your drawing. So just how it's good to have just a few stars, maybe 2, 3 stars in a movie that hold the viewer's attention with all the drama that they're building, that's the same thing with a well-designed drawing. You want to have very clear zones for where you put the detail. Now, as a side note, what you're not seeing in this video is how often I am pausing to resharpen my pencil. Literally every 2 minutes, I'm stopping and I'm putting a super sharp razor fine point onto my pencil, which allows me to then put small detailed shapes in the areas that I want them to be in, like the face and some of the foreground zones. A little note on atmospheric perspective. Don't put a lot of details into the background, because it will push the background visually closer to us. If you want this to feel spacious and like it's an actual environment, put the details, the textures in the foreground, because like that, the foreground will feel close to us and the background will just sit back visually. So what defines a detail? Details are well observed, detailed shapes, particular shapes with clear edges. So as you will notice, a lot of the edges in the middle and background zones are very soft and fuzzy. Earlier, you might have even seen me smudge the charcoal with my fingers so I can get a very soft edge. So you want to maintain the crisper edges in your detail zones and in the foreground zones. Now, the cool part about this is like that you're literally guiding people where you want them to look. Where you put sharp edges, it makes people's attention go there. So you're becoming the director, and people won't even know what hit them. It's just they, for some reason, feel like they want to look at those zones that have the details. And one more point about details. I know we're all detail focused, they're really fun and juicy to dig into, but it's also the subtle nuances that are paying off big time. So even though this is very sped up, the amount of work that goes into the slight variations in the background zone is immense. I am fine-tuning the transitions from light to slightly darker in that background zone, and that too counts not as detail but as attention and will make your drawing look much richer. Now, of course, not everybody loves value drawings. That's totally fine. In that case, you would have gone ahead and rendered this with a more linear approach, and therefore would have gotten another look. And that is the beauty of actual drawing. It's a decision-making process where you are in the driver's seat, and what you think is cool, what you think is interesting, is steering this car into the direction that you want it to go. So I hope this video has given you some good pointers to check on to make your next drawing go into the direction that you were hoping to. Now, of course, if you're ready for more help, look in the description below this video for more resources. Also, let me know in the comments which of these principles you'll use for your next drawing, and I will see you next time. Take care.